Thanks to Lily and Manuel, who aren't here physically with us, but I think who are here with us in spirit, for the invitation to join you all here today at the Design Lab. And as Gray was saying, this talk draws from my new book project on predatory data that was just released. And for it, I want to begin here with a proposition. What would it mean to narrate the origins of our contemporary data economy, not with the conventional knowledge centers and academic and industry vanguards that have dominated explanations of our present information age, but at another kind of temporal setting, that of the racialized datification fever that fed the rise of what was arguably the 20th century's first popular, globally expansive information movement, when eugenic ambitions aimed to provide universal methods for predicting human fitness, and when eugenic researchers, anxiously facing globalization's modern advent and growing independent struggles around the world, seeded a cross-continental movement to monitor our unfitness and to remake society in the image of white Western elites over a century ago. To suggest that we expand the means by which we locate the origins of our contemporary data economy around eugenics, violently segregationist disinformation age, is to not only decenter the dominant narrative of the technological present from its familiar cast of Western technological heroes, genius male disruptors, and enterprise-seeking revolutionaries that have been popularly celebrated as daring visionaries of a new computational future. It's to give name, too, to its explicitly race, gendered, class, and geopolitical predations that even when largely unspoken, have laid long and deep at its very foundations. And as I argue, too, in my new book, to recognize eugenics as a forerunner to contemporary forms of predatory data draws attention to how the targeted monitoring and surveillance of minoritized populations have not been merely incidental outcomes of data economies. They have been rather essential components of dispossessive and profit-generating knowledge regimes that demanded the continuous profiling of populations. Indeed, from their earliest efforts, eugenicists targeted minoritized populations to generate the excess of data that conditioned the rise of new global classes of information elites. Eugenic hierarchies, that is, grew by expanding global information architectures to monitor and assess human populations and to differentiate so-called deserving classes from the physically, morally, and mentally unfit. This project underscores then how eugenic researchers enthusiastically channeled their ambitions through the frenzied development of varied new data methods and instruments for identifying and predicting degeneracy in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These included, as this talk will underscore, intelligence metrics and IQ exams to predict poverty and underproductivity, as much as future cognitive exceptionality. Far from assuming eugenics' disappearance following World War II, this talk will proceed in three parts, tracing an arc from eugenics to what I argue for as contemporary techno-eugenics, exploring how eugenic logics are inseparable from the data-driven technologies behind today's information economy. So part one of this talk revisits the history of eugenic intelligence prediction, unpacking how its use as an instrument for political stratification endures in knowledge economy frameworks promoted by techno-elites today. Underscoring how the spread of a eugenic disinformation age had been diagnosed generations before, however, part two explores how eugenic research has long been contested by immigrant and feminist alliances around data, including ones that emerged in the late 19th century. And returning to the present, part three draws from that legacy of data pluralist methods that justice-based actors continue to cultivate, suggesting strategies for countering AI's eugenic stratifications and monofuturism through a defense of what I'll stress as a defense of improbable worlds. And so with that, let me begin with part one. Nearly a century after US eugenicists popularized IQ tests as a new metrics to empiricize intelligence and predict future value, a celebration of cognitive elites was being revived in new millennial discourse around the knowledge economy. Defined by a shift away from the manual labor of an earlier industrial age, the knowledge economy was framed in the mainstream press and academy of the 1990s as driven by a new class of intellectual workers who were heralded as engines behind a surge in technological innovation and wealth creation. Such framings, however, also relied on a revival of eugenic models of social hierarchy built around the supposed objectivity of intelligence prediction and the myth of the outsized merit and productivity of so-called cognitive elites. These myths around merit and metrics help give rise to what I argue has been a new techno-eugenics driven by Silicon Valley elites who today wage campaigns against supposedly regressive democratic norms and the protection of inferior races. By wastefully undermining the superior productivity and revolutionary potential of so-called cognitive elites, techno-eugenicists allege that democratic policies have produced nothing less than an existential threat to technology and to the fate of the entire Western world with it. Nothing better exemplifies this eugenic revival at the dawn of the new millennium's digital age than the controversial popularity of the 1994 publication, The Bell Curve, Intelligence and Class Structure in American Life. Selling some 400,000 copies in its first 2 months after publication, the text's overnight best-selling status sent its eugenic arguments into the headlines of nearly every major U.S. news outlet, from the New York Times to Good Morning America. Written for a popular audience by longtime conservative and libertarian authors Richard Herrnstein, a Harvard University psychologist, and Charles Murray, a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, the text infamously set off a pitched national debate in the US by leveraging hundreds of pages of data to reassert a biological, racialized basis for intelligence, correlating individual achievement and socioeconomic success with hereditarily determined IQ measures. Across 800 pages, replete with tables, graphs, and data on IQ, the authors argued that the US's most pressing economic and social problems could be empirically traced to questions of intelligence and to problems of both over-investing in populations with lower IQs through things like public education, for instance, and to nationally disinvesting in so-called gifted populations. They stressed two rising demands for the skills of a cognitive elite, who they argued were best suited to meet the needs for more complex labor in an evolving economy where the, quote, manipulation of information would now be central. Broadly decrying welfare, education, and immigration policies that supported minorities and the poor and that drew resources away from the merit-certified elite, the authors asserted an empirical truth to inequality and accused policymakers in the US of creating a national disaster by trying to correct natural hierarchy through democratic policies. By their assertion, quote, inequality is a reality and it is time once again for America to try living with that inequality, end quote. The once again they referred to, of course, was a winking reference to the eugenic roots of their arguments and to the powerful influence Western eugenic researchers once held over national policies and popular culture in the US over a century ago. The Bell Curve's introduction then also framed the text in light of the work of Francis Galton, the British biostatistician credited with founding eugenics global movement in the late 19th century. For decades, Galton worked to find an empirical basis and science of social hierarchy by creating metrics of human physical, mental, and moral fitness. In contexts like the US, eugenics gained political prominence by growing research architectures and methods to informatically monitor and assess human populations and to differentiate so-called worthy classes from the physically, morally, and mentally unfit. Eugenic researchers based everywhere from Harvard to Stanford and Galton's own University College London enthusiastically channeled their ambitions through the development of varied new data methods, population monitoring techniques, and instruments for predicting degeneracy from the late 19th century onward. This included biometric databases for criminals and immigrants, composite portraiture to predict behavior, and genetic surveys of broadly defined dysgenic classes, and indeed IQ exams and literacy evaluations for immigrants and the poor. Their data work amplified through US institutions like the Cold Springs Harbor-funded Eugenics Record Office, the American Eugenics Society, and the American Breeders Association allowed their arguments to spread for the broad monitoring and suspension of basic rights of supposedly genetically contaminating minority populations. Asserting their proximity and freedom of the unfit would threaten the survival of more worthy classes, US eugenicists' work would see the popularization of the notion of race suicide. And they saw too, this is a term, of course, that we've seen come back into popular use and parlance. And US eugenicists saw too to the passage of historic acts in the nation over a century ago, from immigrant exclusion laws to quotas to favor Nordic races, and the eventual passage of laws to forcibly sterilize the unfit, that disproportionately impacted poor, Black, brown, and indigenous women in over 30 states in the US. It It was their data-driven practices, I stress here though, that allowed eugenicists to be so successful in counteracting democratic norms and to arguing that their socially stratifying mission was fundamentally evaluative rather than political. Their normalization of predictive uses of IQ and intelligence tests to promote the segregation of a cognitive elite from degrading populations, thus exemplified, as with other historic policy gains around immigration and sterilization, the efficacy of using data, however questionably derived, to reveal the supposed real truth of human inequality. The US psychologist and eugenicist Henry Goddard, who first introduced the term moron into the medical lexicon to establish a multi-tier classification for the feeble-minded, infamously popularized the use of intelligence testing in the US after translating early French tests into English in 1908. With fellow eugenicists, he strove to prove low intelligence as the primary indicator of deficient self-control, criminality, alcoholism, laziness, prostitution, and even political dissent that would inevitably demand expensive state investments to address. He thus advocated intelligence testing for all US immigrants to exclude so-called unfit arrivals and would seed an intelligence testing industry in the US after distributing copies, more than 88,000, of translated and self-designed tests to schools, immigration offices, and other public institutions. Among the questions, all to be administered in English, that he added to his own exam to assess arriving immigrants were, what is Crisco, the US-made cooking product that had only been introduced into the US market a couple of years earlier, and who was Christy Mathewson, a US-American football player. And this is just an image from a newspaper headline on Goddard's 1913 work to apply the survey that I was talking about to Ellis Island, just to sort of demonstrate that, although many times we think about eugenicists as sort of, and eugenics as a sort of fringe pseudoscience movement that really, you wouldn't have seen on the front pages of any newspaper, certainly not or published about it in the New York Times. That was anything but the case. People like Goddard were making headlines. American eugenicists were really at the forefront. Heads of major institutions in the US, cultural institutions, American universities, from Stanford to Harvard Medical School, et cetera, all had very prominent and quite visible, obviously, public roles. After deploying the tests that he advocated for at Ellis Island, Goddard argued that over 80% of non-Nordic immigrants were feeble-minded. The data he collected was credited to with the passage of the historic 1917 U.S. Immigration Act, the first bill that introduced quotas for all immigrants, and that specifically aimed to prevent the entry of so-called non-Nordic races into the U.S. More than half a century later, it was such segregationist gains in eugenic data that the bell curve's best-selling authors suggested a return to, and that they defended in a revival of the racialized hereditary intelligence models that they promoted. Many pondered how the eugenic arguments that they were advocating for had reemerged with such force in the 1990s, but Herrnstein and Murray were clear about the resonances they saw between their texts and the heightening imperatives of the new knowledge economy. As they wrote, highlighting the demands for the new skills of the so-called cognitive elite, quote, today's technological frontier is more complex than ever, with labor less efficiently performed by non-cognitive elites. Moreover, they wrote, the link between IQ and productivity, quote, goes deep. A smarter employee is, on average, a more proficient employee, end quote. Stressing the existential imperative of industry innovation that they drove. Channeling techno-eugenic anxieties, Thiel further fanned contempt for democracy and welfare states And by 2009, he began to publicly speak and publish on the threat of government regulations and anti-discrimination policies as wastefully supporting regressed populations and blocking industry innovations that would lead to what he called as economic degeneration. Asserting his realization that democracy and freedom are no longer compatible, he'd write that technology and politics are instead, quote, in a deadly race where the fate of our world now depends on the efforts of a single person who builds the machinery of freedom to make the world safe for capitalism, end quote. Thiel, by 2016, of course, was funding US MAGA candidates and Donald Trump to the loud applause of Republican National Convention attendees. And he's also credited with first seeding Silicon Valley's infamous move fast and break things ideology that insists that technological progress should be pursued relentlessly with any, if any, regard for potential costs or dangers to society. Notably, too, despite Thiel's clear techno-eugenic overtones, his obsession with empowering a cognitive elite has earned him countless devotees in Silicon Valley and around the world, with the depth of his influence seen in his enduring role as a mentor and leader in Silicon Valley's so-called PayPal mafia, an exclusive network of elite tech engineers and capitalists that includes Elon Musk, and the founders and investors of YouTube, Yelp, LinkedIn, Facebook, Airbnb, Lyft, Spotify, and Google's DeepMind, amongst many others. Such continuing recoupments can make techno-eugenic expansions throughout the data economy sound unstoppable, but I would be remiss to not mention that alternative data strategies have long been cultivated in distinction to eugenic research methods, including by social justice actors from over a century ago. And so for the second part of this talk, I take inspiration from the data work of past generations of feminists and immigrant organizers whose work recall for us the long histories of intersectional feminist and collaborative data practice, ones with roots in spaces beyond tech industry corridors and startups. More than 100 years ago, feminist data researchers were posing critical questions around gender, power, and data practice, and challenging the standard epistemological infrastructures by which knowledge and data on marginalized communities in particular was fostered so that distinct infrastructures might emerge otherwise. The famed Hull House Project, located in Chicago's multi-ethnic West Side, was founded by feminist advocates Jane Addams and Ellen Gates Starr in 1889 as one such effort. Many might remember its leading role in the U.S. settlement house movement, which by 1910 had grown to over 400 sites that addressed the growing exploitations of urban labor and housing. But the Hull House came to be known, too, for its unique success in advancing such key legal reforms in the U.S. as the 8-hour workday, minimum wage, and outlawing child labor. And it was also a hub for prototyping various approaches to social science and community research that championed a new ethical paradigm emphasizing social justice and that countered dominant ideas of the era that saw poverty as a result of individual failing or eugenically determined racialized heredity. Part of this involved Hull House's design that blended a community center with an educational campus in Chicago's West Side, where local families, largely immigrants and ethnic minorities, could access classrooms and libraries for free courses, kindergarten, and daycare. Theater and art studios were available too, gyms and athletic programs, and a coffee house and meeting rooms that all remained open to the working families and publics of Chicago's 19th Ward. But the success of Hull House also had to do with the novel approaches to research undertaken by residents there to document local labor conditions. Hull House Maps and Papers, published in 1895, was an exemplar and quickly placed it at the forefront of new data collection and output techniques that would later establish fields from urban sociology to social work. Composed of essays by 10 authors, 8 of which were women and 3 of whom identified as U.S. immigrants, and only 2 of whom had had university training in social sciences, the Hull House volume opened with a modest preface by Jane Addams, who cited the color-coded wage maps of London published by Charles Booth in 1886 as an inspiration. But Hull House's Maps and Papers also feature the use of pluralistic data, incorporating surveys and statistics alongside qualitative data and direct testimony from 19th Ward residents. All this to newly capture how gender, ethnicity, and age impacted the lives of working residents and families. Modeling how such added context could powerfully impact research and visualization work, the Maps and Papers volume prompted many later surveys in the 19th Ward, including those that leading sociology departments such as the University of Chicago's would later come to be known for. Chapters on Chicago's wedding system, wage-earning children, and cloakmakers' expenditures, drawing others on Czech and Italian community life and the settlement's impact on the labor movement. Details on the daily conditions of life, from the lack of air, light, and space in tenements to the complex rotations of work and sleep families maintain for labor, were paired with empirical, but until then largely unseen data on the economic system of Chicago's sweatshops. The varying wages for stitching hems, for instance, the premature aging of workers, and the deformities and diseases contracted by working children. The color-coded wage maps of the volume that were paired with the essays further put Hull House's multi-methods approach on display. Co-produced by Alice Holbrook, a student of math and visual arts, and Florence Kelly, a single mother of 3 who was working for the Illinois Bureau of Labor Statistics when she resided at the Hull House. Their maps testified not just to the potential of blending statistical with visual techniques, but to their potentials for challenging and disrupting dominant notions of gender and class-based bias definitions that readers held at the time. Holbrook and Kelly marked their use of households as the measuring unit for income in their wage maps, for instance, to underscore the essential contributions of women and children to family income. They specified that while readers might find it unusual to see the household category applied to both single wage earners, generally assumed to be men, and to the category of family head, again generally assumed to be a father with dependents, Holbrook explained, quote, "In this neighborhood, generally a wife and children are sources of income too. The women wash, do home finishing on clothing, the boys run errands and shine, the girls work on factories or sell papers on streets," end quote. Thus, they argue that standard practice of treating wives and children as dependents negated their economic contributions. As they wrote, quote, "The theory that every man supports his own family is as idle as the fiction that everyone can get work if he wants it," end quote. Hull House's surveys are relevant reminders, too, of the longer legacy of pluralistic research practices that engage the energies of amateurs as well as professional social scientists, and that devoted as much energy to formatting data for experts as for local organizing. By 1895, Hull House and local neighbors were organizing college extension courses that drew hundreds of students, largely young women and neighbors, to classes. It hosted, too, a students' association, several clubs for trade unions and labor organizers, including the Bindery Girls Union and the Men's Typographical Union, both of which were founded in the Hull House, as well as the 8-Hour Club, dedicated to the passage of the Factory and Workshop Bill, a 19th Ward Improvement Club that met with Illinois legislature members, and a Working People's Social Science Club that hosted prominent international activists and researchers for what organizers called simply, quote, "a neighborhood forum for social and economic topics." Such pluralistic data infrastructures made Hull House a generative space for future leaders, with many alum going on to serve in leading roles in diverse history-making organizations, from the NAACP to the ACLU to Legal Aid, the National Consumers League, the Women's Trade Union League, the National Committee on Child Labor, and the Progressive Party. But its project, I'd argue, too, is a reminder of the legacy of undercredited knowledge work that marginalized populations continue to undertake, often outside of the academy, to pluralize research trajectories today. Especially in contemporary Latin America, a site in the space, a region where I've done quite a bit of field work, especially for my previous book. Such work is operated to not only better account for the diverse experiences of lived vulnerability, but to demonstrate how alternative knowledge practices can effectively reset public understandings on such issues as the broad experience of gender-based violence. Efforts surrounding the historic Neo Menace movement have thus been credited with not only amassing some of the largest protests across Latin America, with marches of tens of thousands brought together across diverse ethnic backgrounds, classes, generations, and political affiliations. But Neo Menace has been credited, too, with some of the largest regional data sets on gender-based violence, gathering participants' feedback on a topic notoriously shrouded in silence. In Argentina, such work emerged through a diverse coalition of feminist organizers who volunteered their labor to design a survey on the topic. The over 60,000 responses they received revealed how expansive the experience of gender-based violence was, with over 97% of respondents reporting they had suffered some version of it, and more than 20% reporting rape, while only 5% said that they had reported anything at all to the police. Far from affirming any singular monolithic category of gender-based violence, too, organizers stressed how their findings urged a need to pluralize conventional understandings that had been primarily framed around the experience of women in heteronormative relationships. Alongside the trauma of domestic violence, organizers documented then, they stressed respondents' feedback on the violence stemming from discriminatory policies that LGBTQ populations face, that from the criminalization of migration or from abortion bans and a lack of access to free healthcare. Channeling a pluralist feminist orientation, Neo-Menos' work to broaden and reset knowledge around the variable vulnerabilities of gendered lives animates what the decolonial Argentine philosopher Maria Lugones described as a coalitional consciousness. Such an ethic expands modes of relationality between diversely colonized peoples and importantly enables new modes of connection to be fostered between them beyond the term standardized by dominant colonial knowledge regimes. In the age of big data, decolonial feminist work around data pluralisms also notably serves another function. From Hull House to Neo-Menos, their commitments have insisted on alternatives to predatory data infrastructures that have broadly instrumentalized and profited from a reification of dominant knowledge regimes that segment oppressed peoples into discrete categories of gender, race, and class. By decolonial feminist accounts, such divisions not only fail to account for the complex intersectionality threaded throughout oppressed people's lives, they also reify colonial hierarchies and heteronormative worldviews while diffusing other potentialities for solidarity making. Consistently then, decolonial feminist efforts have operated to decenter what we might have presumed to have already settled as given knowns around gender-based dynamics in the real world, particularly one increasingly defined by big data, where the measure of difference has been used to stabilize and automate gendered and racialized social hierarchies. And so for this final section, I want to explore how decolonial feminists push back on the predatory forms of datification and prediction amplified by AI systems today operate, and how they do this through not just a commitment to data pluralism, but through a defense of what I'll call in this section improbable worlds. And I underscore improbability in this final section to contrast with statistically determined forms of likelihood and calculation for probable majority-based outcomes used by AI systems today. Such majority-seeking approaches are commonly used to predict probable world outcomes through data processed for the largest possible set of users on platforms, sorting the fullness of activity in the real world into predetermined categories in order to achieve some version of scale. Such operations work, too, to keep users blind to other improbabilities, separating populations into a hierarchy of discretely valued classes and classifications, the very work that drove eugenic ambitions across generations. I highlight improbability then to stress statistically minority contexts and conditions that in their existence defy probability and the metrics of scale. Drawing support from unpredictable resources or surprising allies, improbable worlds can often thrive in the face of dominant systems. And whether in the emergence of unlikely outcomes, such as the emergence of a planet Earth in a universe largely hostile to life, or the very thriving of minority communities when dominant forces might condition assimilation, improbable worlds signal the vibrant heterogeneity of being and open possibility across time. This has been harder to notice, however, in a world increasingly defined by AI prediction systems and their amplified projections of probable futures. The prolific real-time recommendations that are channeled through routine interactions from everything from digital identification systems to hiring software, security and navigation technologies to social media and large language models deliver their predictions and shape a reality intended for the largest volume of processes. In doing so, they activate probable world solutions that bias towards dominant views and majoritarian outcomes that can be statistically extracted from a data set. And while such systems can provide users recommendations that appear to be the safest bet, there are many scenarios in which generating probable outcomes for projected futures empirically fails or have led indeed to a range of deadly injustices. This was the case when the AI system Compass was used by US judges to determine jail sentencing, which was found to wrongly overpredict Black individuals and underpredict white individuals' likelihood to repeat committing future crimes. This is the case, too, when students with visual impairments at the University of Illinois, my home campus, were found to be consistently overflagged as cheating by the facial recognition and online proctoring platform Proctorio. And there are other scenarios where the desired future is explicitly not the predictable outcome. This is true not only in cases of predicting the likely reality for minoritized populations, where data sets are too limited or misrepresentative to accurately project future outcomes, but this is also the case in contexts that involve the protection of minoritized value systems, whether racial justice or feminism, where majoritarian populations and values are overrepresented in existing data sets. While such errors are often dismissed by technologists as due to an over or underrepresentation of certain populations in data sets, they fail to acknowledge that when dealing with the fullness of real-world possibilities, as well as the entrenched liabilities of colonial archives and patriarchal datification systems that never fully represented the past, there will always be misaligned data sets. Even when dealing with data sets that aren't mapping human lives, probability-based outcomes have been critiqued for reproducing majoritarian worldviews that extinguish other desired values. AI systems' probabilistic readings of user taste in music, for instance, have led creative producers to critique how such systems have encouraged more formulaic approaches to composition that narrow artistic expression, as producers are nudged gradually towards designing for tastes that scale, and as varied other creative potentials get quietly truncated. Such increasingly narrow monoculturalist terms for legibility and existence within predictive AI-driven platforms are among the pathologies publics now routinely grapple with as technological design is captured by the majoritarian probable world terms of techno-eugenicists. This includes not just figures like Peter Thiel, but of course others like Elon Musk, who well before his unprecedented supercharging of authoritarian and white nationalist politics in the US and abroad, and of course his recent unprompted Nazi salute and follow-up speech before Nazis' far-right AfD party earlier this year, had already been making headlines in years earlier for his increasing amplification of white supremacist posts and eugenic conspiracy theories on things like race suicide and replacement theory, all language explicitly drawn, of course, from turn-of-the-century eugenicists from over a century ago, as well as for his predatory relationship with female employees and his creepy pro-natalist insistence to Silicon Valleyites that, quote, civilization will crumble if we, as in techno-elites, don't have more babies. And so too have his reality-defying outcries of persecution and harm from minorities and anti-discrimination groups, which led him to threaten lawsuits against nonprofits like the Anti-Defamation League for lost revenue and for allegedly seeking to destroy Twitter. Likewise, accelerationist movement figures like venture capitalist Mark Andreessen and OpenAI's Sam Altman have garnered attention for large pro-AI fests in Silicon Valley, thrown to defend AI against its socialist enemies, and what accelerationists call the deranged regulations that threaten to stagnate a techno-capitalist future and slow the rise of AI's supreme intelligence. Too often, such figures have been treated in mainstream discourse as no more than eccentric tech geniuses with excusably naive or juvenile antics, or more recently, following Silicon Valley's visible alignment behind the new Trump administration, have been framed as no more than cynically profit-motivated businessmen. But such frames have failed to take seriously how such actors dangerously depend on the spread of probable majoritarian values and the active empowerment of dominant classes for AI's growth. Through biasing toward probable outcomes, their prediction systems have provided a means to actively amplify majoritarian worldviews into the future, allowing the overblown anxieties of majoritarian populations, nationalists, and the far-right radicals around the globe to go from virtually fringe to front page overnight. While attempting to dismiss, it would be a mistake to not take seriously their effect of distracting away from the actual vulnerabilities that have amplified for other parties all around. Being forced to focus on techno-eugenicist survival, that is, means paying less attention to the narrowing terms for survival and support that they've created for everyone else. Little wonder that growing publics have called for resistance to such systems and their foreclosing of possibilities for other independent and unprescribed futures. Such refusals remind us that accepting Silicon Valley's techno-eugenic terms is far from inevitable. Actively refusing its probable majoritarian predictions, however, means something other than quitting platforms. It means renewing feminist and decolonial commitments to other vital futures beyond those framed by the masculinist paradigms of competitive survival, natural hierarchy, and global scarcity that are designed to keep publics frozen in the precarity of self-preservation. Rejecting techno-eugenic frames thus opened possibilities for registering the present and future on terms that underscore the persistent possibility of and deep longing for solidarity and collective vitalities around data pluralisms and technological alternatives that have never been fully captured by techno-eugenics' monoculturalist agenda. Calling out the false conceit of technological revolutions, projected universalism, feminist data pluralists take seriously not only the violence enacted in attempting to deny the full diversity of futures possible through probable world rejections, they also remind us of the situated nature of alternative justice-oriented data practices and the varied improbable worlds that they support. To respond to the varied temporal orientations of marginalized communities, as feminists and decolonial researchers do then, renews commitments to defend probable worlds that situates data practice in a temporal order outside that of big data's insistence on universality. From such a vantage, stratification can be recognized instead as an uneven and locally contingent process that gets differentially shaped across locales by specific forms of resistance and care by situated actors. From such a vantage, then, big tech companies and institutions driving AI regimes can be seen not as decontextualized global forces, but as entities for which stability relies on sustained coordination across local sites, where local forms of disruption or dissent can still meaningfully register. This project has issued a call then to listen for, remember, and recall the strategies fostered across generations around feminist data pluralism and its multi-temporal relationalities to resist techno-eugenics' false insistence on a revolution imperative, with its singular drive for control and profit as supposedly the highest aim of technology and data work. This is a call to foster a closer recognition of the interconnective work data pluralists brought forth across generations. Such critical reorientations center the experiences and creative methods of marginalized populations, advancing new frameworks in defense of improbable worlds. These include calls for the abolishment of big data that I'm crediting here to the organization Data for Black Lives, as well as calls for data sovereignty that I credit here to the organization the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, as well as calls for counter data that I credit here to the Datos contra Feminicidio, the Data Against Feminicide project, and calls too for data bodies defense that I credit here to the Our Data Bodies project, as well as the Detroit Community Technology Project and the LA Community Action Network. Calls too for anti-spying by groups like the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition, the Mi Gente Collective, as well as calls for collective benefit that have been made by organizations like the U.S. Indigenous Data Sovereignty Group. As forms of situated data practice, these local data encounters that these projects entail recognize the need for fostering varied modes of seeing to challenge unlocatable and unaccountable modes of knowledge practice. They also reveal the inherent multiplicity of potentials for interpretation that surrounds any data set that users are often encouraged to only see as given and predetermined by probability. Such commitments to improbable worlds remind us that dislodging our contemporary imaginaries around data and AI-driven economies with their focus on privileged sites of high innovation is long overdue. Such fixations have artificially kept attentions focused on operations taking place inside the exclusive sites of Silicon Valley firms and research campuses. The outsized attention given to Silicon Valley have only reified probable world castings around big data and AI, and in doing so, they draw attentions away from the invisibilized work of repair and restoration necessary to contend with the global ecologies of exclusion and predation that big tech firms have accelerated all around the world. We need to empower new imaginaries and freedom dreams, including around improbable worlds, around global technologies and society that are not driven by the survivalist fantasies and paranoid self-preservationist anxieties of white westernized techno-elites. The call here to think across time and space reminds us how much work has already been and continues to be committed to reclaim the aims of pluralistic solidarity, restoration, and repair that diverse marginalized communities have cultivated in data work around the world. Other forms of global knowledge futures have long been imagined. How to see ourselves in relationship to them and decenter technology's deadly master narrative in the name of new solidarities is a challenge of improbable world building we're invited to step into today. So thank you. Okay. Man.
Hi, thank you so much for this talk and just for such really super interesting research. I'm Nick Usher. I'm a professor at USD. So I just wanted to, this term data pluralism, I really want to understand it just a little bit better and take a step back. So I'm wondering if you can kind of maybe just break it down a little bit more for me. And then, like, I guess I see almost like 3 modes of resistance, and I want to make sure I'm totally understanding this correctly. So the first is like an argument against just the collection of quantitative data generally. If the second maybe is the production of community-based data. So like we're collecting data in different categories. And then there's one that I don't think I heard from you, and maybe this is the counter data, but I think of the Williams Institute, which takes US Census data and finds all the queer people and is like, look, right? So like using existing data to kind of subvert. So am I understanding this correctly? And can you maybe just frame it a little bit more?
That's great. That's wonderful. So at a very high level, I mean, I think I'm advocating for a recognition of the importance of data pluralism, you know, and in this kind of like balance between qual and quant data. I teach in a school of information sciences, and it's often the way that we, you know, which is is multidisciplinary in the way the academy thinks of disciplines, and, you know, brings in social scientists and some humanists and historians, as well as a range of different methods and modes of information science that work primarily around data management and development, and now increasingly is moving towards development of machine learning techniques and the management of not just big data systems, but again, management of sort of AI and development of AI-based systems. So quite broad range. And when we think about, you know, in these kinds of, when I'm thinking about conversations that are happening, especially in places that are up to the work of designing the future of data science programs, really, when you look at the vast majority of what these programs have emphasized, is really one side of that kind of this kind of qual-quant divide. There, it may be an ethics class here and there, you know, to sort of, and maybe a little bit of policy, but by and large, really sort of leaning into and dominated by quantitative techniques and technical skills as a credentialization for professionalization. And again, you know, very, very little, if any, representation at all of humanistic or anything outside of even just, again, quantitative data management, as again, it's sort of authorizing. So on a very high level, it's sort of just a recognition that there's a healthy conversation, a really necessary conversation, even one that our students, I think, are really hungry to have, a recognition that just seeing the world through quantified data sets, and the kind of quantified data sets, of course, also that are normalized and routinized by social media companies in general and by industry, which is a very specific way of seeing the world through quantitative data. It's not the only way of seeing the world through quantitative data. It's a very specific way, but that is really an insufficient way of capturing what's happening socially, of a read on what the social is. Simply having some sort of, again, at a very high level, a kind of recognition of the way these things need to be balanced, and the kind of destructiveness that really we've seen, not just what a generation of computer scientists trained in a particular mode and data scientists now trained in a particular mode, and now a new generation of young data scientists trained in a particular mode can produce, or what it doesn't produce, and the kind of debilitation of various democratic systems, including ones that technologists and researchers and knowledge practitioners all around the world based in higher education institutions, et cetera, depend on, are being debilitated, right? All of that. So we've seen what a generation of that can do, and partly, that really, I argue, is really partly due to this kind of under-recognition, almost negation of any kind of value of what qualitative data is and can do, sort of work of it, the necessity of it, not just in the work of data science practices and professionalization, but just in the world of what it means to represent human knowledge systems. Oh, thank you, sorry about that. The other part of it is also like that there is, of course, a mantra that many of us who study Silicon Valley, those of us who are in the fields of media studies and communications have sort of been following now across the last several decades, a call from certain sort of boosters of big data systems. Chris Anderson, famed editor of Wired magazine, was one of these boosters who really was predicting essentially the kind of collapse of other knowledge systems with once the promise of big data would arrive, that disciplines are really a kind of messy and sloppy way of indexing knowledge in the world, and that at some point big data systems would become precise and all-encompassing and universal enough that we wouldn't need messy things like history or anthropology or psychology. All of these were just sort of like messy and inefficient ways of modeling or theorizing around the world through these kinds of imprecise heuristics. And at some point, big data systems would really sort of manage to sort of universalize and index the empirical world sufficiently enough that we would no longer need any of these proxy disciplines. They would all sort of just disappear. So that, again, that's another version of why, again, an argument for not just sort of pluralism in the kind of, the kind of humanistic sense of it, like what it means to actually value a version of like pluralistic coexistence, but like very specifically a notion of just, knowledge and data pluralism, and to underscore again just the necessity of that, and also the kind of outrageousness that there is this kind of monodatification, monoculturalist is what I call it in the book, but drive, that this kind of conceit of being able to index the world so the empirical world so perfectly that the dream would be, the utopia would be that we wouldn't need any of these other knowledge disciplines. We could just disemploy historians, et cetera, and just let the work of large language models do this, etc. So that conceit and that sort of that dream, that fantasy, certainly exist for a certain population, and to sort of who have their ears and are in many ways influencing decisions that are getting made in higher ed institutions and knowledge institutions like ones that I work for. And so the third part of it, I think, is something actually that's really practical about like our engagements with students, even in classrooms, and so they're on a very grounded level. The kind of value of data pluralism, just the practice of it, being able to read quantified data alongside qualitative data, thinking about these things is actually just not one is extinguishing the other, not thinking of one as like that these things have to operate in a hierarchy, but that these things are different ways of registering the world, and that we can put these things in conversation with each other. So there's value to still seeing the world through the US Census data, which has a kind of liberal, has its roots in a certain model of liberal data collection. And lots of different ways of that it, of protective work that it does. It is not the full way, of course, of registering either population, and not the kind of perfect way. There are lots of gaps and reasons why those gaps exist. And also kinds of strange modes of like reclassifying and declassifying racial categories that again move along with the times. Putting that into conversation with ethnographic data around how communities, for instance, not just what does poverty look like and what do those statistics look like in your community, but how does it actually translate really concretely into things like local technology use just across the street from the university. Right. So just to say that again, like there are multiple ways of sort of seeing it, both as a kind of political argument, but then also as a kind of very grounded sort of pedagogical argument as well. I hope I got to all the aspects of your question. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this talk. This is picking up off the first question. And I guess I'm kind of wondering about the wisdom of leaning into positivist methods and dominant, disciplines like economics and social psychology as framing this, and again, as it's like a lot of the things you said can be phrased as, oh, that's really bad construct validity, right? That's like, it's bad positivism, it's pseudoscience, right? In ways that say, yeah, you can have better construct validity if you do things in a more community-centered kind of way. But that still, again, it kind of feels like you're buying into something that might get you a little bit of, quick wins, as the tech people like to say, but like locks you into something that's, on the long term. I don't know where I'm going with this, but I'll just turn it back over. Yeah, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. I think that we if their cost-benefit analysis is always around some version of what's the return on investment, and is it worth the kind of investment of time that it would take to get a closer read, a better read. So let's do a user-based study, but let's invest in it for a day, or send out a couple of people to do a couple of quick interviews, and really not really invested in relationships in the long term. So a quite utilitarian approach. That's a very, very different imaginary, I think, than what I'm arguing for. And so, and partly, I think the main thing is not so much to sort of say, well, tech companies are going to do what tech companies are going to do, and our ability to I would hope that now might be a kind of mea culpa moment, at least for some working inside of the tech industry, to be able to have different kinds of conversations around what is the point of our development? Is it always around sort of driving like the bottom line? When we are starting to see, any version, like literally pulling the like safety and security plugs on all of our social media platforms, right? Such that really it was always unevenly distributed, right? 84% of safety and security funding for Facebook went exclusively to the US, and everyone else had to kind of make do with 16% of whatever was left afterwards. So the notion already of like who got to be safe and who experienced some version was not great in the US, but it was much, much worse elsewhere. But the question being, is it really, is really the point of institutions like UCSD, the University of Illinois, is our point to sort of only cultivate a certain kind of orientation to technology practice such that that is normalized? Is it only about kind of instantiating that constant calculation around what is a cost-benefit analysis here? Is this really like, how can I increase my own bottom line, and that and revenue generation is my primary point, as opposed to why might we think about a data science or AI curriculum that is not designed to primarily keep industry happy? Could that be a proposition? And what might that look like? Not necessarily because it's going to turn the tech industry into its prototype overnight, but because it starts to generate a future workforce and a future society that is asking other kinds of questions, and that might not even imagine then the tech industry as the lone place, the highest place, the apex of where they might go. What might that do if we might actually just ask, is that my job, really, at the University of Illinois, to keep tech companies happy through the data science courses that I design? Anyway, yeah. A radical question, right? Yeah.
Hi, thank you for that talk, especially like, the first thing I want to say is that high review slide, like, it like blew my mind, because I've done like a few of the interview things, and like, I knew it was a way to go through a mass amount of applications, but I had no idea they were like training on my face.
Yeah.
But other than that, I'm a computer science major, and I really don't like the state of the tech industry now, and like, I'm gonna graduate soon. I wonder if you have any like next steps that any of us students could take when we're trying to just survive in this new world, and like getting a job in like a safe way or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, thanks for that question. I will say that I also, this is an invitation for many of us also in higher ed, recognizing that these next couple of years are going to be a funky set of years. So I've had conversations as well in my institution to say, like, what would happen if we just opened up a couple more fellowships inside of our lab spaces? Not necessarily that they all become funded, but they at least become nominal, and they give students, our graduates, means to be able to organize their time and to think really purposefully still about what their commitments are and to still maintain some version of intellectual community. I'll also say that, there's another way of also thinking about this, not so much of, everyone will have to have different kinds of conversations, of course, according to their own context and local settings, and things like debt. The debt that this generation of students faces is really unlike the kind of debt that a previous generation of students have faced before. I mentioned that only because I have graduates of the class of 68 and 1970 who were from the U of I's campus who participated in alternative computing cultures come back for an innovation studies course that I teach to talk to my students. And many of them were part of not just, of course, the countercultural protests of their day, anti-Vietnam War protests, et cetera. But after they graduated, almost all of them went on to have some version of alternative social investment, I would say, like spent a couple of years really invested in projects that they cared about. Sometimes at a very local level, doing things like education for education programs for a local jail or alongside a local jail. Sometimes working in various kinds of social service and education-based efforts locally. They thought of it really, and this is a different generation, but they thought of it really as a kind of creative period. They did not graduate with enormous amounts of debt. But they did. It allowed them their degree from whatever. The University of Illinois is really thought of as a top public university. It's where in Illinois, but they thought of it as really a way of breaking them outside of the formula that a kind of previous generation, where everything had sort of been standardized before. The 50s generation might have kept them in that sort of like rote. Here's the next step. Here's what you're supposed to do. The kind of turmoil, the tumult, the degree of uncertainty, but also just transformation and change that we were seeing all across the country in this period, and that manifested through the Vietnam War protests, the end of the the deposing of Nixon. All of that translated in a lot of ways too for their own ability to start to think a little bit more freely and openly about what they might do with this kind of period. So a lot of them went on to do things quite experimentally, but also that were manifestations of their own commitments, genuine social commitments. Now, many of them are work as historians and university professors and librarians or educators in local communities. Definitely their kind of own professional paths ended up stabilizing. So there's a question too of what might happen if we started to think also about this period. Not so much as just, there is going to be a lot of instability. There's no question because of the sort of defunding for different kinds of research outlets, et cetera, that are out there that are tied to traditional institutions. But what might happen if we started to think about it as instead this kind of period that precisely because of this period that hopefully will restabilize. We're seeing some kind of pushback in public spaces, and we're certainly seeing elections outside of the US really strongly manifest an anti-U.S. hegemony, U.S. Trump, administration. So we'll see what happens with the midterm elections, at least for sure, concretely. But one could say that already we're starting to see manifestations of some version of real protest that will hopefully mean that there is some kind of stability back to something that looks like a little bit more, that will allow a little bit more experimentation from this kind of generation of students. So that's what I might invite. And the third thing I will just say is just that there is any number of new projects also that are vibrant and alive in local communities that are especially sort of thoughtful about and trying to sort of really build out new critical conversations around the growth of surveillance tech. It's happening all across the US, new kinds of bills that are trying to call for more public oversight or a little bit more pushback for the growth of surveillance tech, especially by law enforcement, and with real concern exactly for what it might mean, even in states like California that are typically termed blue states, that even in blue states that data sharing that may happen between forms of local law enforcement and state law enforcement and then federal law enforcement really compromises the security of local populations, exactly with that kind of cognizance in mind. Everywhere from smaller communities like Urbana-Champaign to larger ones, you really see a large movement for growing literacies and new kinds of coalitions around to build community debates and conversations against the growth of surveillance tech. So, I mean, and there are various sorts of also local projects that have manifested that I think don't always register as sort of like, established institutional basis for where to sort of invest energies and where new kinds of project work sometimes foments. But I might also sort of suggest that as a kind of third base. Yeah.
About alternative futures and care and restorative framework-based approaches. But we also know that the logic of care doesn't quite interfere with the logic of scale that governments or industries try to do, or they kind of prioritize how to minimize time in terms of, because care needs time, whether it's like giving a service and other things. I feel like as a researcher, I kind of face with this thing, if you try to think of restorative or care-based approaches or alternative imaginary approaches, whenever you try to present that work, let's within a CS community or other communities, they'll be like, the question of scalability comes up, or how is it even feasible enough? So how to approach that question in one hand. And I feel like even within there is, as researchers, we're like working within university campuses, but even universities are kind of suspending many of their mental health support for students and introducing AI chatbot or tutor support, replacing them with AI tutor and everything. So how do you think the role of university as an institution where they support these researchers and how to resist all those things?
And that sort of, I think, maybe gets to some of the some aspects of the other questions that were being asked around sort of what are we really sort of pushing back on? This does not happen overnight. And the failure of liberal institutions to both more thoughtfully address what it may mean for us to sort of think about what does care look like within knowledge professions writ large, but then also what does it mean to sort of reinstantiate that in a kind of education system? What's our obligation to teaching and sort of reproducing some version of care practice amongst the future knowledge workers, rather than just thinking about reproducing a version of, scale worker at scale. Like our job is to kind of graduate as many data scientists to let Facebook work as fast, or OpenAI work as fast as it possibly can, or worse, Twitter and whatever. Okay, so absolutely not. But just to say that, this didn't happen overnight, and the failure and the inability that knowledge institutions, including, again, public, land grant universities, R1 institutions like ours that are officially on the page, are committed to research for the public good, really have sold out their kind of public mission. Again, the notion that what we've done is started to design data science programs really to keep industry happy. The notion that we are so deeply disconnected with what it is that a public at large might think, not just about sort of how does the population or larger Californian public, Illinois public, think about the research that's coming out of the UC system or the U of I system. Do they feel connected to it? And I will say that on average, when you look, I'm only, I think because of the topic of the talk is really on technology and AI, just on the topic of AI and technology, the public is not on the same page as us. Absolutely not. I mean, when you look at survey after survey, you can look at the Pew Research Center's surveys on AI and public opinion on AI, and they are so far away from what AI experts think. They've done surveys essentially to kind of comparing the average workers' opinions on AI and security in the job market, and security in just the economy in relationship, comparing that with what AI experts think about AI, literally day and night, absolutely the opposite. And I think all of us might have already guessed this, but the average community member, I'll just say, the average American, you see the statistic replicated over and over again, 50% of Americans don't have more than $500 saved in the bank. only 40%, or at best 50% of Americans have some relationship to higher education and, an institution, not necessarily a 4-year, degree granting institution, but that is not, again, that is the average experience of the economy, the average American. No wonder they come onto a campus like the U of I's and see a lot of shining technology, a lot of wonderful resources, modeling the future, but in a way that is completely disconnected from their own day-to-day lives. And again, so this question around how do we model care, there's a lot of work that needs to get done. And this does not just happen overnight. It may seem like with an election, of course, we get a big change in administrative and executive power leadership. But this has been something that's been in place, really, the logic of it and the kind of alienation and really the kind of design really for a very, very small segment of the population. It's gotten a lot smaller with this administration, but this has been going on for a while. And what you're calling for as a kind of new orientation around care work, thinking about how we might not just sort of think around acceleration and scale of output as sort of the only economic ends, but thinking instead around like how might we be more think about a kind of connectiveness, some version of, I think about it as like, I start with like just solidarity. If we could just start with that version of conversation across STEM and social sciences fields, because there are disciplines across your campus without a doubt that have some of this already modeled in practice. They just feel under-resourced and beleaguered and probably not particularly well recognized or protected for that kind of work. We certainly have it at the U of I, and I will say that, again, it's not that faculty members and there aren't people who are up to this work and are really breaking their backs to do it out of real social commitments and bravery in trying to really imagine what a different kind of institution might be. It's a lot of invisible and under-acknowledged or underpaid labor. So what would happen instead if institutions like this, like ours, might start thinking instead about that as really a center of a kind of conversation and building out different kinds of bridges for genuine conversations. That's not just tokenizing their participation around a table, but really empowering their voice exactly around this question around how might we just think about care technologies, care work, temporalizing things around care and research. What does that genuinely look like? And being much more inclusive of a broader public rather than, designed for output, in this way of return on this model of thinking that prioritizes return on investment and an economization of output. So.